Book of Daniel. Our first lesson was introductory in nature. Our second lesson last week dealt primarily with chapter 1. We nearly completed the first chapter, and tonight we will make an effort at finishing chapter 1 and beginning chapter 2. And I think that you will find the first 6 chapters to be exceedingly familiar to you, and yet the story still resonates, and the lessons are just as valuable today as they have ever been. And I want us to keep that focus as we go through the text. I believe that one of the best arguments for faith in God and in the inspiration of the Bible and the deity of Jesus is found in the book of Daniel. I can find no other explanation for this book and its accurate portrayal of the future than to acknowledge that God was back of it all, the God who knows the end from the beginning. Men simply do not have that ability. And I would like you to keep that ever before you as you listen to the news and you hear all manner of prognosticators predict all kinds of dire situations, the melting of the ice on Mount Everest, the rising of sea level, and the impending climate destruction. Just remember that those are all predictions of men, and men are really lousy at seeing the future. I sleep well at night because when I hear that some man has made some monstrous prediction, I just remind myself that God is in charge. He has always been. He will always be, and I don't fret about that kind of stuff. If you do, that's your right, but don't forget that we have no ability to see beyond the moment. But God knows the end from the beginning. We pick it up in chapter 1. Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, have completed their education and are to come before the king. The king is Nebuchadnezzar. He was the general in charge of the Babylonian army as it began to conquer Judea and ultimately to destroy Jerusalem and the temple. But his father, Nabopolassar, died. And so Nebuchadnezzar rushed back to Babylon, where he was put on the throne and became, as a result, I believe, of the book of Daniel, probably the best known of all the Babylonian kings. He had a philosophy that is rather interesting given what we know in history about kings and conquest. When most kings conquered a kingdom, they took the spoils of war, including those women who were attractive, and often brought them into their harems and satisfied their fleshly desires. Nebuchadnezzar took the best of the young people of the nations he conquered and brought them back to Babylon to educate them and to make it possible for them to be useful in the kingdom and the governance of the people. That's a rather unique thing that makes, in my judgment, Nebuchadnezzar really stand out. I don't know why, when we read Daniel, that Daniel is always remembered by his Hebrew name, and his 3 friends are always remembered by their Babylonian names. It's just one of those things that's inexplicable, but you'll see that as the story begins to unfold. As we pick it up tonight, I want to finish chapter 1, beginning in verse 17, and then we'll read a section of chapter 2 and begin our analogy of this. But chapter 1, verse 17, as these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. They seemed to excel in the midst of all of those who have been brought back to Babylon for education. And Daniel, who we believe is the author of the book that bears his name, and Jesus, as we reminded you in our introductory material, acknowledged Daniel as the author, seems to have been a notch above pretty much everybody else. And his friends were not far behind him. But Daniel had ability not just in literature and wisdom. He seems to have something that even his friends lacked, and that was an understanding in all visions and dreams. And of course, this statement is made because the author knows what will follow. He will soon tell us the story of Nebuchadnezzar and his first dream and Daniel's part in all of that. But here at the outset, as chapter 1 closes, they're brought to the forefront, and Daniel in particular, we're reminded, has a special ability in understanding visions and dreams. Now, there are people today that believe that your dreams have great meaning and they have the ability to identify the meaning behind the dream. My experience is that dreams are by and large just pretty crazy things. And they're inexplicable. There may be things that happen in the course of a day that kind of get thrown together in a night dream, but the real meaning is not available, and I can find nothing in Scripture that will indicate that God communicates today to his people in dreams and visions as he once did. Of course, as Bible students, you know the significance of dreams. You encounter them in the very first book of the Bible in relationship specifically to Joseph, but there are others. And so those who claim to be able to interpret dreams often had far greater influence on people than they really deserved, and that will be pointed out, I believe, in chapter 2. But Daniel, he's one of the rare exceptions, and he's an exception because God was with him, and his abilities came from the Creator. At the end of the time, that is at the close of their education, and I mentioned to you that the Persian practice, we know historically, was generally for about 3 years of intense education from 14 to approximately 17, and some believe that they may have incorporated that system because the Babylonians utilized it first. In all probability, Daniel and his friends were 14 or 15 when they are removed from Judea and taken to Babylon and begin this intensive training. It's approximately 3 years later. I don't know that we're to consider the 3 years to be a full 3 years, because often in Scripture parts of years are counted as whole, but the process involved at least the parts of 3 years, and that procedure has been completed and is, it seems customary, they will be before the king. So the king had commanded that they should be brought in, and the chief of the eunuchs, whom we identify as Ashpenaz, the Rabsaris in the original language, is in charge of seeing that this educational process plays out well, and he is to see that these young men are brought before King Nebuchadnezzar. The king spoke with them. I remember when I had my first, what I would consider a real job. It actually paid decent money. I worked for a couple of years in summers, but I never made enough to really justify working. And I sat down with the superintendent of the plant, and we conversed for a few moments. I don't remember any of the questions he asked. I don't remember any of the answers I gave. I just remember him saying to me, I just wanted, as I do with every employee, to sit down, especially when they're young men, because you never know when you might get a pig in a poke. And I never forgot that. I think that obviously this is a wise thing for Nebuchadnezzar to do. I don't have any idea what questions he may have asked them. I certainly don't know any of the answers, therefore, that they gave, but they stood before Nebuchadnezzar and they passed the test with flying colors. Verse 20 says, "In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them." He may have asked them math questions. I don't know, Darrell. But I have a hunch that if he did, they gave him the right answers. And had they not given him the right answers, we might have had an entirely different story here in Daniel. But every question he raised, they answered, and answered in a very capable way, so that he found them, the text says, 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all of his kingdom. Now, we're going to meet this group of magicians and enchanters and Chaldeans and sorcerers in the next chapter. I don't think that, to be honest with you, that there is a lot of difference between these categories. I think they are just terms that are utilized to describe the same body of men who wield power over the king because they claim to have insights that ordinary people don't have. They're closer to the spiritual realm, they're closer to divinity than others, and therefore their advice the king would perceive as being advice from God. Well, Daniel and his friends are actually perceived by Nebuchadnezzar to be 10 times better than his advisors, who are supposedly connected with the Babylonian deities. Now, obviously, those Babylonian deities didn't even exist. But Judaism is rather unique in that it proclaims the one true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And all of Israel's neighbors were polytheistic. They had many gods and were always ready to embrace another one. And that's pretty much typical of world history, with the exception of Judaism and a group in Persia called Zoroastrianism, which also acknowledged one deity. Just about every other religion took in as many gods as the human mind could imagine. You may recall in Acts 17 at Athens, Paul was just overwhelmed by the religiosity of the Athenians. He even saw one inscription which was dedicated to the unknown God. You mention every god you know, and then to cover your bases, you reference the ones you don't know as well. He said, that unknown God that you ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you. So there's something very special about these boys, and it's going to become abundantly clear in the next chapter. But in the final verse, it says that Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Now, the Babylonian Empire followed the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were defeated by Nebuchadnezzar's father. And the Assyrian Empire fell by the wayside, and the Babylonian Empire resurfaced again, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the new empire. It will be followed in succession by the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and then the Roman Empire. And it's really important to keep that chronology in your mind because that's exactly what chapter 2 is all about as it unfolds. The history of the next, essentially, 600 years is laid out by God in a dream to Nebuchadnezzar, which Daniel discovers with the help of God and interprets for the king. Because this dream is so clear and its interpretation so obvious, many people find Daniel to be a book that is, to say the least, very suspicious. You see, the critics, the liberal theologians, can't believe that there is such a thing as predictive prophecy. They don't believe that anyone could write about events that are hundreds of years into the future with the kind of accuracy that we find in the book of Daniel. And so they argue that Daniel was not the author and that it wasn't written when clearly the text itself reveals that it was written, and argue that it was the product of someone around perhaps 168 BC or so, or shortly thereafter, who has the ability of hindsight and can look back and say, this is what happened. There was a Babylonian kingdom, a Medo-Persian kingdom, a Greek kingdom, and that ultimately the handwriting on the wall, so to speak, indicates that Rome ultimately will prevail. Now, some find that even unacceptable because they don't believe it's possible to even see just shortly into the future and conceive of a Roman Empire. So they say that the four empires are the Babylonian, the Median, the Persian, and then the Greek. The only problem with that is historically there has never been a Median empire. It was always the Media-Persian Empire as it's depicted in the book of Daniel and elsewhere. But they do that again because they just can't accept the possibility that an inspired man could write accurately of events that are centuries into the future. But isn't that what Isaiah did in Isaiah 7:14 when he spoke of the virgin birth of Jesus, looking centuries down the road? Of course it is. That's what predictive prophecy is all about, and it's one of the greatest evidences to the inspiration of the Bible and to the existence of God that I believe we will ever encounter. And that's why Jesus said in John 5:39, you search the Scriptures, for in them you think you have everlasting life, and they are they which testify of me. So Daniel 1, which begins in 605 BC, is all about introducing us to Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and their interaction in the Babylonian kingdom with Nebuchadnezzar. The first year of King Cyrus would take us down to about 539 BC, when Cyrus became the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. It was Cyrus that Isaiah had predicted would be responsible for sending the Babylonian captives who desired to return to Jerusalem back home to rebuild their city and their temple. And the historical record of their return you encounter in Ezra and Nehemiah. Now let's go to chapter 2. I want to read the first section, and I urge you to just grab your Bible and follow along as we look at the storyline as it unfolds, and then we'll come back and make some observations verse by verse. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show me the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree of the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. And Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. So there is the introduction in chapter 2 to Daniel's first dilemma. And it's a story I know that we all are very familiar with, but it's so powerful. It illustrates that what no one else can do, God can do. And the argument that these magicians and astrologers and soothsayers and Chaldeans made is that the king has asked what no king has ever asked before, that no man can actually do. Daniel says God can do. The true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And before chapter 2 closes, he will demonstrate the accuracy of his response. So let's look at the text. It shouldn't take too much time, but then I always say that, and I get caught up in things and move slower than I intend to do. But that's beside the point. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, this would be the third year for the boys to have been in Babylon. Remember, in Babylon, they do not count the first year in a king's reign. No matter if it began in January or December, it was year zero. It was his coronation year. And when we look at this and look at what we learn in chapter 1 about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel coming from Jerusalem to Babylon, what we're probably dealing with here is that the 3-year period covered portions of 3 years, and their education is now completed, because the obvious inference as you read the close of chapter 1 is they're done with school. Now it's time to go to work, and this is the first example of them really being put to the test. Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. There must have been something recurring, and not just one dream, but several dreams, perhaps the same dream repeated frequently, and it is so troubling that Nebuchadnezzar can't sleep. I don't know if he actually remembered this dream or if he's merely testing his advisors to see if they can actually do what they claim to be able to do, to interpret dreams. Because Nebuchadnezzar seems to be under the impression that if you can interpret a dream, you ought to be able to conclusion to draw. If you get your power from the gods, and the gods can know what men cannot know, but you have a line to them, then tell me what I dreamed. Now, it may be that he completely forgot the essence of the dream, and that may have been one of the other reasons that this was so troubling to him. I have had experiences, haven't you, when you've dreamed and you wake in the morning and you knew that you dreamed, but remember any vivid details. I also have dreams that are very vivid, and some of them are recurring. I find myself dreaming on a regular basis about needing to make a phone call with a cell phone that isn't working, and I'm doing all kinds of things, taking it apart and removing wires and putting wires in other places, and I just can't get right buttons to work. That happens to me, I don't know, I guess probably once a month. I don't know what it means, other than I couldn't wait when my first cell phone was replaced by a second one to tear the first one apart. I couldn't wait when I got my second computer to tear the first one apart. I just really wanted to see what was inside. I don't know if that's something to do with my nature. I don't think there are any spiritual overtones to it, but it's at least something that I remember. And of course, you all know the infamous dream that I've shared with you before, the nightmare that my wife has started smoking. I haven't had that dream, by the way, in decades, but I would wake up in a cold sweat, and she's never had a cigarette in her life that I'm aware of, unless she's a closet smoker, and I don't smell it, so I'm assuming she's not. I don't think it means anything, but this man's dream, or dreams, does mean something. The king commanded the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. Chaldeans, by the way, is a term that is used in two different ways. It sometimes is used to describe Babylonians in general, and here in this text it is used to describe a specific group of advisors who have it in with the king and whose word seems to carry a great deal of weight. And I don't just pull this stuff out of the air. I have read so much in preparation for this class, and one of the things that I found several times is this acknowledgement that Chaldeans has that twofold meaning, and you have to determine the meaning by the context. But that's generally true with any word. You need to understand the context to really grasp the significance of the word. I think probably that there's not a lot of difference between enchanters and sorcerers and magicians and Chaldeans. They're just a group of men who advise the king, who claim to have an in with the spiritual realm and with deity that ordinary men don't have, and therefore their word with the king carries greater weight. Kings not only like Nebuchadnezzar, but kings in most other kingdoms sought similar advisors. Even King Saul, after outlawing sorcerers, went to the witch at Endor seeking a word from Samuel. So people believed that this was possible. But Nebuchadnezzar may be experiencing some doubts at this time. And by the way, when Samuel was called up, the witch of Endor had nothing to do with it. And if you read the account carefully, she was as surprised or more surprised than Saul. God sent Samuel back with a message to Saul, and honestly, the witch of Endor had nothing to do with it. And Saul was wrong for even consulting her, but that's a different story for a different time. Here are all these supposed skilled advisors, but they cannot do what the king asked of them. The king said to them, I had a dream. I read that and I think Martin Luther King, but it has nothing to do with Martin Luther King. I had a dream, and my spirit was troubled. I was worked up and anxious. You know, we sometimes use anxious when we mean eager. This really is anxious. I was worked up. I was troubled. I was anxious to know the dream. The king in Aramaic. And now, from this point in chapter 2, verse 4, through the close of chapter 7, Daniel writes in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. Chapter 1 through chapter 2, the first section of verse 4 is written in Hebrew. And now when they respond to the king, everything that follows thereafter is in Aramaic. What language would the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, the magicians, the astrologers, all of these folks speak? Aramaic. It was the language of Babylon at this time. And so Daniel, who has been educated in the literature and language and history of Babylon, just easily moves the transgression, no, that's not the right term. I'm not sure what term I want to go from one to the other. He just moves from Hebrew to Aramaic so easily. And now we have the Aramaic in the original. I'm going to stick with the English. I don't read Aramaic. I know a little Hebrew, just enough to be dangerous, and some English. O king, live forever. Now, when you're in a position like they're in, one of the things you have to do to keep your position is always speak well of and look up to and show deep respect toward the king. If you become belligerent, if you are insulting, if you tell him what he doesn't want to hear, your head may be on the block. And so they start out as you would expect them to do. O king, live forever. Tell your servants this dream, and we will show the interpretation. Now, I get that. I have a pretty good imagination, don't you? If you told me your dream, I could come up with something fairly quickly. I wouldn't tell you it was true. But if you would be foolish enough to believe it, that's on you, not me. All it takes is a good imagination for somebody to tell you their dream, and you tell them what it means. I think the king knows that. So the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, "The word from me is firm. I'm not joking around here, guys. I mean what I say. I want you to tell me what I dreamed. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb." And he's just not making small talk, folks. Nebuchadnezzar has no problem seeing men torn limb from limb. After all, you'll learn in chapter 3 that he had no problem tossing 3 Hebrew boys into a furnace that was heated 7 times hotter than normal. So hot, in fact, that the men who tossed them in perished. Matter to him, just a barbecue, as he saw things. So he was very serious. If you don't do what I tell you to do, I will tear you limb from limb. And your houses shall be laid in ruins. They will become garbage dumps. Some translations say dung hills, manure piles. I'll tear you limb from limb, and the implication, many scholars believe, is, and your families as well, so your house will be in ruin, and your estates will be garbage dumps. This is serious stuff. I know what I want you to do, and you better do it, or you will pay the price. But on the other hand, carrot and stick stuff, we get the stick, here's the carrot. If you show the dream and its interpretation, show the dream, and then tell me what it means. But you have to show me first before you tell me. You shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. What does this remind you of? Isn't it similar to the story of Joseph before Pharaoh? The one caveat is that in that story, Pharaoh tells Joseph his dream. He actually had 2, but Joseph says the 2 are one. That's one of those math issues where 1 plus 1 actually is 1. The 2 are one, because the dreams differed in the visions he saw, but the meaning was identical. And Joseph was able to share with Pharaoh that God was going to bring 7 years of plenty upon the land, followed by 7 years of famine. And as a result, Joseph was elevated to the second highest position in the kingdom. And he was given all kinds of gifts and became tremendously powerful in the Egyptian nation because He interpreted Pharaoh's dream. But he didn't do it. God did it. He just did it through Joseph. And Joseph makes that abundantly clear. And as chapter 2 actually continues to unfold and we read the remaining section, you'll find that Daniel does not claim ability for himself. He acknowledges that this is something that only God can do. We've got to stop with verse 6 this evening.